So we've covered being alone. So let's talk now about being in groups. We have another set of, I don't want to call them mythologies, but we have a set of worries, let's say, about groups as well. And they're parallel to the worries that we have about being alone. The big worry about groups is that groups make us conform. And you have this great article that I've asked you to read today by Solomon Asch about the conformity of people when they're shown lines on cards. The basic experiment was done as follows. He put a bunch of people in a room and he held up these different lines and he said to the people in the room, which is the bigger of the lines? And on one card he had a line that was, let's say, this big, and on another card he had a line that was even bigger. And these lines were of a different size. And he went around the room, and what he did was he asked these Confederates to make mistakes. In other words, he asked plants, people that were put there on purpose, to make mistakes and to make the same mistakes systematically to see whether people who came after them would actually try to conform with the group and claim that the wrong line was actually the right one. Or would they actually stand up to the group and would they ultimately choose their line, the one that they thought was bigger, over the group's line? And it's a fascinating study because, first of all, it's taken by many people to suggest that people most of the time will break down. And it's really important to read this carefully before we come to the conclusion that we live in a world of conformists. Because in 65% of the cases, when you look at the table really carefully, people don't break down. People, most of the time, in 65 or 66% of the cases, I think it was, actually stand up to the group and say, no, I think it's that one. But in 35% of the cases, people don't stand up to the group and they pretend to go along with what the group says. And there's all kinds of interesting little effects in the study that you'll see depending on the number of people that come before them and how close they are to the person in the role, and all of this has an effect on the entire outcome. But the main point of the study is just that being in social groups can be a very dangerous thing because they cause people to conform. That is the message. Now, it's really interesting to see how this is presented because the author of the article, Solomon Asch, ends by saying, this is trouble for our society. This is a big deal. This is something that we have to take really seriously because conformity is a really bad thing. And the fact that there would be this much conformity may mean that society may actually be in trouble. And this is kind of one of the ways that we're taught to think about social groups in general. Now, the problem of this kind of reasoning and the problem with the way of looking at it, of studies of this kind that is so popular, is that they're really out of context. They're presented in a way that is not like daily life. The laboratory experiment that we're seeing is not like situations that we see in our daily lives. In our daily lives, we have a certain contextual connection with people that we're going to be agreeing or disagreeing with. I would argue that Asch is wrong, and that all of these people who are so worried about all of this conformity are wrong. That the fact that 35% of people in the room conform with the majority is actually no big deal when you think about it in terms of the larger society. What I mean by that is that in real life, we have these connections with other people. We have past and future relationships with them. And when we're in a meeting, let's say that I'm in a faculty meeting here at Princeton, and somebody in my faculty meeting says, the big line is smaller than the other one. But I think it's the other way around. Every time someone says that, am I going to raise my hand and say, no, I believe you're wrong. It's the other way around. No, it doesn't make sense. I'm not going to start a fight with somebody over the size of the line every time the issue comes up. And there's lots of times in real life that things are more ambiguous than the sizes of lines anyway. In most situations that we are in life, we're not talking about lines. We're talking about, is this professor's work whom we're thinking of hiring more interesting than that professor's work, say, in the context of a university? In everyday life, if I'm involved in a situation where I'm doing something even as objective as the lines, and I know that I'm going to be in a meeting with that professor the following week, and then the following week after that, and by the way, possibly for the next 30 years, I'm going to be with these people. Am I going to sit there every week and sort of undermine their judgment? I think actually that it's very functional to engage in behavior where you do conform with the majority, where you don't call them out on the fact that they got the line wrong. And when we read these experiments in relation to everyday life, we are going to realize that this big worry about conformity is not such a terrible worry after all. It's also interesting that in 66% of the cases, the people did not agree. They disagreed anyway. So that shows that people in general, the majority of people, when they see something wrong, they will go ahead and make that point publicly, even when it is in a public situation and there's social pressure. And then finally, it actually might be a greater number because in this case, when you're in an experiment and you're going into a room and you're being paid to do this, there's really nothing at stake for you at all. You're being paid regardless of what you say. You don't really know what the experiment is about, so there's really nothing at stake for you, and it's stressful to disagree with a group. So you can imagine that in a situation where there's more at stake and there's a reason to disagree, then somebody may. And I think that's true of me. If I'm in a room and there's a reason to disagree, I'm not one of those people who just goes along with the crowd and conforms with what everybody thinks all the time. If there's a good reason to disagree with people, I will. But it just doesn't seem to me necessary to do so all the time. So I think it's very important that we interpret these things in the right way and that we not do so in an unrealistic way. And I think that people can read this and they can think, oh my goodness, the horrors of conformity. They can read the Asch experiment and say the horrors of it. I would hate for you to go away from the Asch experiment with that kind of interpretation. Nevertheless, let's also be aware of the fact that being in groups does affect the outcome of things. Group dynamics are extremely important. And you guys in your lives are going to frequently have things happen to you in groups. There are going to be group dynamics, and there's going to be conformity, and you're going to find people not standing up for things that they should be because of group pressures. Group pressures are very real, and we have to take them very seriously, and the Asch experiment illustrates that.